Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at some pretty significant potential changes to federal government websites.
Yeah, this is this situation it touches on a lot of different areas. So diversity and inclusion,
Yeah,
climate change, even, how people express themselves online.
right.
So it really underscores how much influence these digital platforms have, I think, on public discussion these days.
Definitely. And we've got two sources today from CBS News about this, both focused on the possibility of diversity-related content being removed from these websites.
Right.
And it's a complicated story, so we're here to break it down.
Yeah, it can be, when you have these kind of evolving news stories, it
Yeah,
can be really helpful to understand sort of the sequence of events
right.
to kind of, give us clues about the motivations and what the consequences might be.
Absolutely. So early last week, the Office of Personnel Management, and they're the folks who oversee the federal workforce, sent out this memo.
And this memo basically told all federal agencies to remove anything on their websites, the social media accounts, that was related to what they call DEIA offices.
And DEIA stands for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility.
Okay.
So essentially, these offices work to promote those values within the government.
Right. And the memo set a super tight deadline for all this stuff to be taken down, 5:00 Eastern Time on Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
Although, oddly enough, the date that they seem to be referencing, January 22nd, was actually a Tuesday.
Oh, that's interesting. It just adds to the confusion around all of this.
Yeah, it does. And then to make things even more, I guess, murky, reporters asked President Trump about these possible website shutdowns.
hmm
And his response was, quote, "If they want to scrub the websites, that's okay with me."
Interesting.
Pretty vague. Right.
Yeah, it doesn't really confirm or deny anything.
Yeah.
Leaves a lot open to interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that sort of ambiguity in political communication,
Right.
Allows for different audiences to take away different messages, depending on their existing viewpoints.
Definitely. But here's what we know for sure. As of Friday, January 31st, the websites for all federal departments and agencies were still online.
Right.
CBS News even got a statement from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirming that she said, quote, "The agency websites are still up and running."
Okay, so that's an important point. It seems like despite all this talk about scrubbing websites, that the reality hasn't been as drastic as some feared,
Right.
at least not yet.
Right. There have been reports of other content being removed, though.
Ah.
Politico is reporting that employees at the Department of Agriculture, the USDA,
Yeah.
were told to take down any pages on their websites that are related to climate change.
And according to Politico, this order came directly from the USDA's communications office.
Right.
So that suggests that there's at least some level of coordination going on within the administration regarding these content changes.
Yeah, it really does feel like there's a bigger picture starting to emerge here. And CBS News also confirmed reports that health departments and nonprofits that receive federal money, we're talking about groups that often address things like health disparities, were told to remove anything mentioning gender and equity from their programs.
That connects to an executive order that President Trump issued earlier this week, which we'll
Yeah.
get into a little bit later.
Right.
But essentially, an executive order is a directive from the president that has the force of law. So,
Fair.
and this particular order seems to align with the administration's overall stance on these issues.
It does, and this raises a big question of how can these organizations possibly comply with such broad instructions, especially when so many of their programs were specifically designed to address, inequities or deal with diseases that disproportionately affect, say, transgender people?
Yeah, and that's a very valid concern. I
Right.
mean, removing this information about gender and equity,
Yeah.
it could actually undermine these programs, make it harder for vulnerable populations to get the services they need.
Right. And then just to complicate things further, there was this initial requirement that federal employees stop using pronouns in their email signatures.
Oh, wow.
And some people are worried that this ban might end up applying to those health departments and nonprofits we just mentioned, the ones receiving federal funds. They're often referred to as grantees.
Right. Well, that raises some pretty profound questions about freedom of expression.
It does.
It could discourage people from expressing their gender identity.
Yeah.
And there are also questions about whether such a ban would even be enforceable or legal.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah. Okay.
It feels like we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these changes.
Yeah.
What stands out to you so far as the most significant aspect of all of this?
Well, you know what worries me the most is the potential impact on public trust.
Oh,
When government websites start being selective about the information that they present, it can erode people's confidence in those sources. They
yeah.
might start questioning whether they're getting the full picture.
It's like a domino effect, right? If
Yeah,
we can't rely on government agencies for accurate information, then where do we turn?
precisely. And that's where independent media and fact-checking organizations play such a vital role.
Right.
It's more important now than ever to have multiple sources of information and to really think critically about what we're reading and what we're hearing.
Yeah, you're right. We can't just blindly accept everything we see.
Right.
We have a responsibility to stay informed and to question things, especially when it comes to information from the government.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not about rejecting everything outright,
Right.
but rather about engaging with the information actively.
Right.
Asking questions, seeking out different perspectives, and forming our own conclusions based on a solid understanding of the facts.
So if we bring it back to these specific changes on government websites, what are some potential long-term consequences that we should be thinking about?
Well, one possibility is the loss of valuable data in research.
Okay.
I mean, think about those DEIA offices.
Yeah.
They conduct a lot of research and analysis on diversity and inclusion.
Right.
If that information disappears from government websites, it could hamper future research efforts and limit our understanding of these issues.
It's like we'd be taking a step backwards in terms of progress, wouldn't we?
That's a valid point. And it's not just about research either.
Right.
Taking down information about climate change could have a serious impact on our ability to address this global issue effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. And on a more practical level, think about all the people who depend on these websites for information about health services, social programs, other essential resources.
Right.
Changing or removing this information could create a lot of confusion and make it harder for people to access the help they need, especially those who are already facing systemic barriers.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
We need to consider the real-world consequences for everyday people, particularly those who are most vulnerable and might already struggle to get access to information and resources.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
One change leads to another, and the ripple effects can be much bigger than we might initially realize.
It's a complex situation, and it's important not to jump to conclusions or make judgments without all the facts.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have to stay vigilant, ask questions, and demand transparency from our government.
I couldn't agree more. And moving forward, I think it's important to remember that information is power.
Hmm.
The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to face these challenges and hold our leaders accountable.
Well said. Knowledge is power, and it's our responsibility to use that power wisely.
Now, to shift gears a bit, I'd like to talk about this potential removal of information related to gender and equity.
Okay.
We already touched on how this might affect health departments and nonprofits.
Right.
But what are your thoughts on the broader implications?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that these changes are happening within a larger context.
Okay.
We're seeing this broader trend of attempts to control narratives and restrict access to information that doesn't align with certain political agendas.
It's almost like certain voices are being silenced, or at least minimized.
That's certainly a concern.
Yeah.
When we limit access to diverse perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
we risk creating a society where only certain viewpoints are deemed acceptable.
Right.
It can stifle critical thinking and create echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that reinforces their existing beliefs.
And that can be incredibly dangerous, can it? It prevents us from having meaningful dialogue and finding common ground on important issues.
Absolutely. It's essential to engage with different perspectives,
Yeah.
even if they challenge our own beliefs.
Right.
That's how we learn and grow as individuals and as a society.
So if we connect this back to the website changes, how do you see this removal of information about gender and equity playing into this larger trend of controlling narratives?
Well, one interpretation is that it's an attempt to erase certain identities and experiences from the public sphere.
Okay.
By removing information about gender diversity, for example,
Yeah.
it becomes easier to ignore the needs and concerns of those communities.
That's a disturbing thought. It's almost like pretending those people don't exist.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to push back against these efforts.
Right.
We have to recognize that information control is often used as a tool of oppression and marginalization.
We can't allow these voices to be silenced. It's our responsibility to amplify them and ensure that everyone has access to accurate and inclusive information.
I agree. We have this moral obligation to stand up for those who are being marginalized and fight for a more equitable and just society.
And on that note, I think it's important to acknowledge the potential harm that these website changes could cause to individuals and communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By removing information about gender identity and expression, for example, we risk creating a climate of fear and hostility for transgender and gender nonconforming people.
Right.
They might feel like their identities are being erased or invalidated.
And that can have a devastating impact on their mental health and well-being.
Precisely. It's crucial to remember that words have power,
Yeah.
and the language we use can either affirm or deny people's existence.
We have to be mindful of the impact our words of actions can have, especially when we're in positions of power or influence.
Well said. It's about recognizing our responsibility to use our voices to promote understanding, empathy, and inclusion.
So shifting back to the practical implications of these website changes, what are your thoughts on the impact on research and data collection?
It's a huge concern.
Yeah.
Removing information about gender and equity could create a significant gap in our understanding of these issues.
Yeah.
It could make it harder to track progress, identify disparities, and develop effective policies and programs.
It's like we're losing valuable pieces of the puzzle, which makes it much harder to see the full picture.
Exactly. And without that comprehensive understanding, we risk making decisions based on incomplete or biased information.
So to connect this back to the bigger picture, how do you see these website changes impacting public discourse and the way we talk about these important issues?
Well, I think it's a real threat to open and honest dialogue.
Okay.
By limiting access to information about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're essentially narrowing the scope of what is considered acceptable
Right.
or even worthy of discussion.
It's like we're being told what we're allowed to talk about and what we're not.
And that's incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
It creates a climate of censorship and self-censorship where people are afraid to speak up or express their true thoughts and feelings.
We need to push back against that and create spaces where everyone feels safe and empowered to share their perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. It's about fostering a culture of respect and open-mindedness where we can engage in constructive dialogue and learn from each other's experiences.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the key message you want our listeners to take away?
I would say this.
Yeah.
Don't underestimate the power of information.
Okay.
It's the foundation of a well-informed and engaged citizenry.
And we have to be vigilant in defending our right to access information, especially when it comes to issues that affect our communities and our lives.
Absolutely. Information is power, and we have a responsibility to use that power wisely and ethically.
Well said. Now let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some potential long-term consequences of these website changes and discuss what we can do to stay informed and engaged. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but the story is still unfolding.
Yeah.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are still missing.
Right.
What are your thoughts on the long-term consequences of removing all this information from government websites? Information about diversity, equity, climate change, even gender identity.
Well, it's hard to say for certain, but I think we can look to history for some potential clues.
Okay.
One concern is that this could set a dangerous precedent.
Right.
If this administration can successfully erase these topics from government websites, what's stopping future administrations from doing the same with other issues they find uncomfortable?
Yeah, it does make you wonder where the line gets drawn, right? What could be next?
Exactly. And it's not just about setting a precedent.
Right.
It also sends a message about what kind of society we want to be,
Okay.
what values we prioritize.
Yeah.
When you erase certain topics or viewpoints from public spaces, it's like saying those things don't matter.
That's a really powerful point. It's almost like we're being told what's acceptable to talk about and what's not.
Yeah, and that can have this chilling effect on public discourse.
Right.
People might be less likely to speak up about these issues or even to seek out information about them if they feel like those topics are taboo.
It's almost like we're losing those aha moments. Those times when we learn something new and it shifts our whole perspective.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Those moments are so crucial, I think, for personal growth and for societal progress.
Yeah.
When we limit access to information and diverse perspectives,
Right.
we limit our ability to learn and evolve.
So given all of this, what can we do to stay informed and engaged, even when it feels like information is being controlled or manipulated?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be aware of our own biases.
Oh.
We all come to these issues with our own preconceived notions.
Yeah.
And it's important to recognize those biases so that we can be more open to information that challenges our worldview.
It's like checking ourselves before we wreck ourselves,
Mhm.
right? Making sure that we're not just seeking out information that confirms what we already believe.
Exactly. And beyond that, I think it's important to diversify our sources of information.
Okay, great.
Don't just rely on one news outlet or a social media platform.
Yeah.
Seek out diverse perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable.
It's like eating a balanced diet, but for your brain.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Okay.
If something seems off or you're not sure what to believe,
Right.
do your own research.
Yeah.
Talk to experts, read different articles, and form your own conclusions based on the evidence.
Yeah. It's empowering to realize that we don't have to just passively consume information.
Right.
We can be active participants in shaping our own understanding of the world.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is more important now than ever before.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it's a lot to process.
It is.
But I hope you found this conversation insightful and engaging.
It's been a pleasure discussing these important issues with you.
And to our listeners, remember, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking questions. That's the best way to navigate this complex world we live in. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Okay, so we've talked about Alert a lot, but there are still so many unknowns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the long-term consequences of all of this? Removing this information about diversity, equity, climate change, even gender identity, like what happens down the road?
Well, it's tough to say for sure, but maybe looking back can give us some clues.
Okay.
One thing that worries me is that this could set a dangerous precedent.
Yeah.
Like, if this administration can just erase these topics from government websites,
Right.
what's to stop other administrations from doing the same thing down the line with other topics they just don't like?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, where does it stop, right?
Exactly. And it's not just about setting that precedent. It's
Yeah.
about what kind of message this sends,
Okay.
Like, what kind of society are we? What do we value?
Right.
If you take away these certain topics from public spaces, it's like saying those things don't even matter.
That's a good point. It's almost like we're being told what is and isn't okay to talk about. Right, and that can make people less likely to speak up.
Yeah.
Or to even look for information if they think it's not allowed.
Yeah, it's like we're missing out on those moments where we learn something new and it changes how we see things,
Yeah, exactly. Those moments are so important, I think, for all of us to grow.
Yeah.
When we shut down information and different ways of looking at things,
Mm-hmm.
we can't learn and change.
So with all of this going on, what can people do to stay informed, even when it feels like some are trying to control information?
Well, first, I think we need to be really aware of our own biases.
Okay.
Because we all have our own ideas about things.
Right.
And we need to know what those are so that we can be open to other views, even if we don't agree.
Right. So check ourselves before we get stuck in our own ways, right?
Exactly. And another thing is to get your information from different places.
Okay.
Don't just rely on one news source or one social media.
Yeah.
Look for different views, even if they make you uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's like eating your vegetables, right? But for your mind.
I like that. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Okay.
If something seems off or you just don't know what to believe, look into it yourself.
Okay.
Talk to people who know, read articles, decide what you think based on what you learn.
Yeah, it's good to remember that we don't have to just take in whatever's out there.
Right.
We can think for ourselves.
Yeah, thinking for yourself is so important, especially now.
Well, on that note, I think we're about ready to wrap things up.
Sounds good.
It's been a lot to think about today, and I hope it's been helpful for everyone listening.
I really enjoyed talking about this with you.
And to everyone listening, remember to stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions. That's the best way to deal with all of this. Until next time, keep on diving deep.